Hello, and welcome to episode 91 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Phoenix, Arizona, I'm Dr. Nick Zoutra. That's right, folks. As of April 2024, I have successfully defended my dissertation from Indiana University, Bloomington, under the supervision of psychologist and philosopher of psychiatry, Dr. Peter Zakar. Now, with the dissertation out of the way, I am starting back up the podcast, beginning with my first guest, the program chair of the 2022 Philosophy of Science Association meeting, Dr. Holly Andersen, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Simon Frasier University. Holly works in philosophy of science and in metaphysics and epistemology broadly construed. Much of her work relates in one way or another to causation, causal explanation, application of causal methodology to case studies in philosophy of science, problems related to mental causation and to the connection between action and causation, and the metaphysics of causation. She also has ongoing work in time and temporal experience. Holly is currently working on a project funded by the Foundational Questions Institute on consciousness in the physical world. Her project considers the behavior of specifically temporal variables in information theory as it is used in the integrated information theory of consciousness. Her other ongoing central projects focus on patterns and pattern identification, mathematical versus causal explanation, especially as related to model use, and on implications of the causal nexus for pattern ontologies for phenomena. Holly also recently co-edited with Dr. Sandra Mitchell a focused volume, The Pragmatist Challenge, with chapters that have emerged from the talks and discussions in the Pragmatism, Metaphysics, and Philosophy of Science workshops. The volume lays out a vision of pragmatist approaches to contemporary philosophy of science, especially topics at the intersection of metaphysics and philosophy of science, and will hopefully be rich territory for future discussions to explore further. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Holly. Dr. Holly Andersen, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Friday morning?
I'm doing really well. How are you, Nick?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to meet you. How are things in Vancouver?
Things in Vancouver are really lovely right now. So summer has finally hit, and it was a really wet, cool spring. So everything is green and there's berries all over and it's really pleasant weather. So it's kind of the best time of year to be in Vancouver.
I'm happy to hear that. I haven't probably been. I think I've been to. I've been to Washington State, which is just south, but also Whistler once. So kind of had to flow into Vancouver and travel up that way. Just absolutely gorgeous.
It really is amazing. And the mountains are just right there. And they're still covered with snow and it's nice down here. The cherry blossoms have already bloomed. So it's been,
I'm happy to hear that. So what are you getting up to this summer? What are you doing any summer teaching, dabbling back into research? What are you up to?
Well, so I have some writing projects that were a little bit overdue, but I just finished 2 of them. So
congratulations.
Thank you. It was very nice to hit the deadlines. And they were both sort of related to pragmatism. One was kind of on pragmatist metaphysics and sort of the density of structure in the world. And then the other is on, I've been doing a lot of work on patterns metaphysics, and I always get this one objection. And it was like, okay, finally, I have an entire book chapter that will address that one objection. So I'm doing that. And then I'm also, I go to Norway every summer. So we're about to take off and head to Norway.
Oh, wow.
And it's really fun to get to be there. And sometimes we get to do things with the philosophical community over in Scandinavia. And then so it's fun to sort of keep a connection to not just the North American philosophers of science, but also people working in Europe and Scandinavia.
Do you have any personal connection to Norway, or is it just a lovely place you like to visit?
Well, my husband's Norwegian, so
I assume. Okay, I wasn't.
We met in graduate school, and we sort of agreed we'll probably have to get jobs here, but then we'll keep a very solid foot over there. And there's a really interesting, group of people who work at the University of Oslo, especially that.
Oh yeah.
I wrote half my dissertation at the University of Oslo, so it's
Oh,
It's nice.
wow. Oh, good. Well, hopefully we'll find out a little bit about that.
Yeah.
And from what I've heard also, we chatted a little bit about before we went on this, started, but, I know I might have met you briefly at the PSA, the Philosophy of Science Association meeting in Pittsburgh, of which you were an organizer for, or sort of the chair,
Program chair.
program chair, which is a much more, I mean, that is like probably the most challenging job, for running a conference is the program chair.
But I think the executive director has a harder job.
Okay.
And part of what was challenging is we started it with one executive director and then we didn't have one for a while. And then the new executive director had to sort of come in and everything was kind of like it was up in the air and hadn't quite fallen and hit the ground yet. So that was challenging for him, I think. And for all of us, but it came together really well. So I felt like the Pittsburgh PSA, was really fun and there was a lot of good stuff that went there. But yeah, I think I also saw lots of things and met lots of people that didn't register entirely on my brain, because there was just a little bit of overload.
No, of course. There were so many people there, but from an attendee's perspective, it was excellent. I happened to be serving as a visiting lecturer in Pittsburgh at the time, so
nice.
I managed to bring my class to some of the presidential plenaries, or one of them. I think it was.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so they appreciated it. It was just a good opportunity to have some direct engagement, and see just meet a number of other philosophers of science. So it was good.
I think for students, just actually seeing what it looks like when we do our thing is invaluable. Like it's hard for them to conceive sometimes when you're just reading articles in a classroom, what it actually looks like, live action. But I feel like, at least for me, the live action version is just a lot more fun. So that's a great opportunity for your class to get to go.
Yeah. And just, again, bringing in the scientists is really great. I remember there was this fun symposium. Did you go to the science journalism symposia by chance?
I didn't. It was conflicting. It conflicted with some other thing that I was in. So yeah.
It was interesting and somewhat, it was a good meet because you had folks from like Radiolab and NPR and I think it was Wired magazine. So you had these journalists, you had scientists and philosophers of science kind of arguing a little bit in certain ways as to the ethics. And so I found when you get a bunch of different people in the room, like a lot of new things can happen and fun things can happen. And so that was one of the memorable symposia that I recall.
Oh, nice. Yeah. No, I really think that the PSA is great for that because you can get people from other fields and there's a way for them to come interact. And there's no way to sort of plan where the conversation actually goes when you get into a good Q&A. But I feel like that's where like things really happen and come together and move forward is in those good Q&As. So anyways, I like the PSA as a venue for getting to do those sorts of discussions.
How do you feel about the one that's coming up in 2024? Is it New Orleans, right?
In New Orleans, yeah.
So,
well, I'm really excited because I get to go. I was talking to Kevin Elliott about this. Like, essentially, you get to go as a civilian. Like, now I don't have to do anything. I just get to show up and enjoy myself. So that will be really fun. And I have a symposium that I'm involved with, and I think that will be really interesting because it's drawing on some of my new areas of work that are much more connected to the geographic and sort of social and historical area that I live in. So in the greater sort of Metro Vancouver area and what's called the Salish Sea. And then there's going to be a really awesome presidential plenary where we bring in some outside scientists and specialists, and we're really looking at this kind of juncture that New Orleans sits at, where the Mississippi River, that drains just huge parts of North America, comes into the Mississippi, or comes into the Gulf of Mexico, and then into the Atlantic. So I feel like the sort of the water flow and those kinds of issues and the intersecting sort of like social, political, and modeling landscapes will be really fun to talk about.
Fantastic. Well, I'm very much looking forward to it. Well, before we get into talking about your research, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you, where you come from, how you found your way into philosophy of science. So, Holly, if you could tell us a little bit about where you grew up.
All right. So I grew up in Kalispell, Montana, which is up in this little northwest corner of Montana. So there's this big valley called the Flathead Valley, and it's a really lovely place. So it's in the Rockies, and it's just a little bit to the west of Glacier Park. And then it's just to the north of Flathead Lake, which is also just this gorgeous freshwater lake. And then it was also where there was right at the top of the valley, there was a ski hill, big mountain. And so, which used to be a very affordable thing to do when I was growing up in like the 80s and 90s. And so there was a lot of like outdoor stuff that was really close by. So it was a really interesting place to grow up as a kid. And I'm very, very fond of Montana. But I find it's also just like a weird place to be from when you come into academic philosophy. Like there just aren't that many Montanans. And there's even fewer in academic philosophy.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Well, I just spoke with a philosopher who's at Montana State, actually. Prashanta? I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah. He was one of my undergraduate professors, actually.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
how about that? Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, he wasn't from Montana, but right. Oh, yeah. It's like there's just not as many. Montana itself, it's a very large state, but it's also very spread out and just.
When I was growing up there's like 800,000 people total in the whole state.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And in fairness, they were all concentrated over in like the western part. Cause like in Montana, there's sort of the strip of the Rockies. And then sometimes you like refer to the rest of it as like West Dakota. And there's very few people in West Dakota. Everybody's over in the mountains.
Yeah. So what was it like growing up in Flathead? I mean, you described a little of it. What were you sort of interested in, as a kid and adolescent?
Yeah, so I used to read all the time. So I was known as the kid who, like, literally I'd be walking down the street reading and I would like trip over things because I was reading. So I read a lot of stuff growing up. And I'm from a family that's like sort of been around Montana for a while for the most part. And so it was very kind of like place situated. I had never heard of philosophy until I went to college, actually, and just like stumbled across it. I'd never really gotten into that sort of stuff. And I grew up in a family where there was there was really no emphasis on anything that you might consider an intellectual pursuit. And so.
What did your parents do?
So my dad is a forester. Well, they're retired now. So my dad is was a forester for a private timber company. So there's an area outside of Kalispell that was sort of owned by a private timber company. And so he was in charge of like setting up logging areas and then doing the replanting, and you do like stream management so that you can keep the water quality high, and you do fire stuff in the summer. So it was in some sense really interesting because sometimes you just like, he would just chuck you in the truck and then you're out with him all day. Right. And so I learned some what are now turning out to be really interesting things about like, putting in roads with stream management. And they have these things called the best management practices that are implemented in really interesting ways. And especially with the fire season, like there would be a fire and it overlaps with like 4 different jurisdictional areas because, fires don't care whose land they're on. So some of it's like a, BLM, Bureau of Land Management, and some of it's like National Park, and some of it's private. Anyways. So it makes it this really complicated logistical coordination task to try and do something about that. Yeah, so I grew up there, and I think I got really lucky in a bunch of ways because it was settled largely by people from Scandinavia in like the early 1900s. And they came with this real sort of sense of civic obligation. And so they really wanted to make functional towns where people sort of took care of each other in a really low-key way. And so I grew up, it was a very sort of poor town, and I grew up in a kind of poor family. But at the same time, there was just awesome educational opportunities because they were just there for everybody. So there was just the public schools, and they were all really well funded. So like sports teams, I discovered only when I got older. In other places, you have to sort of pay for participation or buy your own stuff. They're sponsored by people. And so you just get to join for free because they thought this was a good thing. And they had like summer camps all around the lake that you could sort of go to for like a discount or for free. Because the Scandinavians are like, no, children are supposed to be in nature in the summer. So,
that's wonderful. Is that associated with all? I feel like there's some like I'm learning about these early childhood sort of mentalities, but that sounds like I don't know. Well, that being in nature is one of those, but this sounds a little bit more throughout adolescence as well. So that's really cool.
Yeah, throughout adolescence, even through high school.
Wow.
And it was really nicely, and this is one of the things that I still bring, I think, to a lot of my philosophy. There was a kind of civic orientation to it where you knew that you'd sort of made it as a businessman in the town because you were able to sponsor a softball team every single year.
I love that.
And so, it was this real like, no, this is only going to work if we help each other make it work. And And so later on, when I was in graduate school, I'd sort of compare, like, what did I get to do in high school with what other people got to do? And there are people who went to really lovely, fancy, expensive boarding schools who got exactly the same education that I ended up getting for free just because that's what was there.
Yeah.
So that was a fortuitous part of it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, tell us a little bit about how did you find your way into philosophy of science, or even philosophy in general? What was your path?
So, well, when I was in high school, I was convinced I was going to be like, at first I was going to be a novelist and a poet. And I read a whole bunch of stuff, including a lot of science fiction. But then I started getting interested in sort of more pop science. So I read Stephen Hawking's book, and that had a big effect. And then some people started recommending other things to me. So like I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And then I got into, I don't know, so that was sort of a background of things that I learned about. But I became convinced that what I was going to do was go into theoretical physics and then just like solve the problem. And there would be like one grand. So I was that really annoying person who's like, no, there will be one scientific theory. There'll be one equation that governs everything, and I'll discover it, and then we'll just have it all sorted out. So that was my plan when I was in like high school going into college.
Sure. Well, I remember also starting to read those pop theoretical physics books, and I didn't have a huge background in physics, but I think there's something there in terms of like the way they sort of motivate the mind in that kind of way. And so I don't know, I relate in that regard. I'm hailing that sense, but you're right. Having this, like, this is what I'm going to do. Like, I mean, I think that's fine. I think we have to have a little bit of sort of, maybe, strong confidence in our abilities to some degree, but
no, that's very true. Well, and I think a lot of it too, I mean, I don't know what it's like these days, but back then there was just a lot of time where you had nothing else to do because you're like, in Montana, there's like long stretches where you have to drive somewhere because everything is very far apart, or you're wading through something and you really just needed something to think about. And then I discovered there were these books that really gave you something to think about while you were just sitting there, otherwise being bored, staring out the window. So that was kind of the original, like, that planted the seed. And then I went to, I went to Montana State University. So I'm from a background where nobody really knew anything about college. And didn't really know how to apply to colleges. And I remember my senior year, I'd done really well on sort of the SATs. And so lots of colleges were sending me pamphlets. And my family was like really confused because they thought these were acceptances to these schools. And they didn't understand that, like, nobody knew how you actually applied to things. Does that make sense? They have to like fill out the form, put a little check with it, and send it off.
Oh yeah. No, it makes sense that of the not under awareness of that. I think about that a lot, that like those who, it takes a lot of background knowledge to just even approach the application process for your
didn't
kids.
Really have any guidance at all whatsoever on like, where could I go or what could I do? And I had no financial support from my family for it. So I had sort of ruled out in my mind the places that you would have to pay. I didn't realize there were also like financial aid options because nobody knew anything about financial aid either.
Makes sense.
Yes. But I got, once again, really lucky because they had a sort of full scholarship to Montana State University, and I got one of those. And so then it's for 4 years, but for as many credits as you can take. So then I went to Montana State University in Bozeman, and I was majoring in physics. But I thought, okay, I can overload myself with courses doing other stuff because this is my chance to just see what else there is. Because I have free credits, like no matter how many I take. So it was maybe a little intense for those 4 years because I was taking too many classes. But at the same time, I was looking up physics, and you used to have to do it in this paper book that showed you what the courses were for the next term. And just before physics was philosophy. And I was like, oh, maybe this term I'll try my one new, I did some photography classes. I tried some other things. And I was like, oh, I'll try one of these philosophy classes. I was like, oh, actually, this was really fun. And so it was just the happenstance of it being alphabetized next to the physics section that I started taking philosophy classes at Montana State University. Yeah.
Oh, I love that story. It's always, not always, but I love the happenstance. Just like,
yeah.
Okay. So what was it about philosophy? What clicked for you?
Well, so I went through in physics, and this was like kind of back in the day. And so it was really hard being a female student in physics. So there were two of us who were going through, and I didn't really have opportunities to work with other undergrads in like research. Like sometimes you just sit there and do your homework together, and that makes it a lot easier. But there was a lot of like, if I can't date you, then you're not allowed to be in my group.
Oh.
And so it was a very kind of ostracizing experience to go through in physics there. I later found out that actually that department ended up getting sort of nationally censured, and I didn't. So it really was like bad even for that era, but I didn't know that it would be different elsewhere. So at a certain point in time, I was like, okay, I can't continue in physics because I just can't keep doing this to myself. So then I have to find out, okay, what am I going to do if I don't do physics? And it took me a while to figure that out. I thought I was going to go into mathematics. So I almost got an extra major in math. But I discovered in the math department, it was the same kind of dynamic of like, we're going to ignore your existence unless, first we're all going to ask you out. You'll say no, and then we'll ignore your existence. Yeah. So that was like, okay, know that. But fortunately, I'd taken a bunch of philosophy classes from someone named Gordon Britton. And so I graduated, and at a certain point in time, I was like, look, I don't know. I went back to his office. I took an entire trip from Kalispell back down to Bozeman, drove 6 hours. So I could say, look, I don't know what to do with myself. Do you have any good suggestions? Like, you know me pretty well. What should I do? And he's like, well, and he had this very funny way of talking too. And he said, well, there's this one person named Nancy Cartwright, and I think you'd really get along with her. You should go talk to her. She's at the London School of Economics. So maybe you should, go to the LSE and try that. So I looked it up and I was like, okay, they have a master's degree. So I knew nothing about it. And I only applied to this one place because I didn't know anything about grad school. So I just sent off my application. I had a double major in physics and philosophy at that point in time. And then they accepted me. And I was like, okay, this is sort of maybe my one shot to see. So I had to take out a very substantial student loan for that 1 year. But I was like, it was a shot. And then I got there and I was like, this is what I'd been wanting to do. Like this, the physics people were not asking the questions that I wanted to ask. This is what I had been looking for. So it all sort of fell into place when I went to the LSE on the recommendation of this one professor. Yeah. So in that sense, I got there. And then once again, I was like, well, this was before you could really look things up conveniently on the internet and get like all the data about different kinds of departments. Lots of, in like 2001, 2002, departments didn't even have sometimes websites. So I then applied to just a small handful of PhD programs and got really lucky again because I didn't know that there were two different departments at the University of Pittsburgh. I just heard that they were good in philosophy of science. And so I sent off my application to the philosophy department. And then one of their sort of admin support staff people called me up on the phone and she was like, look, I've looked at your application and I really think that you wanted to apply to the history and philosophy of science department, not us. And I was like, that's a department? And she's like, yeah. So I'm just going to walk it across the hall and give it to them if that's okay with you. And I was like, sure. If you think that's... So she saved me. And then And then I went to HPS.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that story. And I appreciate you, discussing sort of the move based on sort of a lot of happenstance. LSE is obviously a very prominent place in philosophy of science, probably even back then. Well, so tell us a little bit about once you've made the transition to realizing you want to do, or at least take this more seriously in a professional manner, like how did you go about, developing your training in history and philosophy of science? What was your experience like there?
Well, so coming into Pitt was sort of hard because like my first year was really difficult there because that was when I really discovered how different I was from a lot of the other students. So there were lots of students from really much nicer institutional backgrounds for their undergraduate degrees, who some of them were very kind and some of them weren't. And some of them, it was really that experience of like, there's this entire sort of insider lingo is what it felt like. And I didn't have sort of a way in. And it's kind of hard because, I also now know of myself and it sort of makes sense back then. So I'm neuroatypical and I was also queer coming out of Montana. And then you show up in this place and you're just like, wow, I don't fit in any regard whatsoever. Like, this is just awful. And so at the end of my first year, I just about dropped out because I was like, this is not I had a lovely experience at the LSE, and all the grad students were great. And we had great discussions. We got along really well, even though they were also from different backgrounds. But then I came here and I was like, wow, so there was a very different vibe. And at first it was really hard to get into it.
Oh yeah. So, it doesn't sound very, I mean, despite it, it's a top program, it's very strong, but it sounds like kind of a top, well, as you described, it's a difficult, not as maybe inviting atmosphere as what it could have.
Yeah. Well, it's worth noting too that a lot of that was HPS is a really small department. And we took a lot of our courses that first year also with the people in the philosophy department, which is much larger. Right. And so there was this, like, trying to figure out the dynamic between the two departments. And there was just sort of this predominant weight of people in the other department. And that was a lot of stuff to sort of figure out. So that was difficult. And I really came close to dropping out. And actually I had a buddy who was living in Santa Monica, and he'd just finished his first year as a lawyer, and it had also kicked his butt. And so we're like, okay, we're going to decide, do we want to continue with these things? So I just like couch surfed in California for the summer. And I went back to waiting tables, and I was like, okay, what am I going to do with myself? And I decided, okay, I'll give it one more year and then see how it goes. And then the second year it got much, much better. And so then I sort of figured out how to do it. I found people who were giving me more helpful feedback, like on my writing. So for me, I really needed to work on my writing in a more academic style. I hadn't learned how to do that. And then I started sort of having more of the discussions and getting more into it. So some of the professors were also really fantastic at HPS at helping people kind of find their feet in the program. So I really benefited from the informal mentorship that took place in HPS. And then finally figured out, okay, this is a thing I can do. I'm going to stay here. And that's around when I figured out I didn't want to do philosophy of physics anymore either. So I came in thinking that I would do philosophy of physics, but the kinds of questions that they were sort of asking at the time weren't things that I was that interested in. But what I found I wanted to do instead is still something that kind of sticks with my work, which is one of the things that you do in physics that the things that you do that scandalize the mathematicians were the things that I really enjoyed doing. I can take this and just play fast and dirty and do some really awful stuff. And then I can use it over here in this way that sort of technically is mathematically awful, but also it works really effectively.
Okay.
So some of my work has been I'm just going to steal some of this representational mathematical structure over here and then just deploy it for a different topic because it works really well. So I didn't want to do philosophy of physics. I just wanted to do this philosophy by borrowing from physics.
Interesting. Yeah, sure.
So.
Okay. So what, in terms of what were some of the big questions that you were attempting to address, and how did you go? And you kind of described a little about doing that, but what were you hoping to sort of, provide further clarification or potentially resolve?
One of the things that had always been bothering me since I started taking courses, and actually it's discussed in other places too. So even when I was in high school, I was really, it's not the issue necessarily of free will versus determinism, but the way in which there can be sort of genuine causal efficacy in the present moment that isn't just a sort of consequence of here's some laws, and then you plug in some initial conditions, and then you sort of run it forward. And so I was really interested in sort of where, and this was just when causation was barely getting started. It was the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. And so there was sort of this turn that felt oh, wait, we're sort of figuring out what to do with causation in this interesting new way. I got to TA a course with Joel Smith at Carnegie Mellon University on causal reasoning. It was this new thing that they were doing. And I was oh, actually, this is really a powerful technique that you could use for all sorts of stuff. So I took that on board. And I was taking courses in the Center for the Neural Basis of Cognition at Pitt, while also there was some courses in the physics department on statistical mechanics and thermodynamics. So my dissertation kind of brought those things together with there's people making these really huge sweeping claims about oh, there is no free will, there's only free won't, or something like this. And it's no, it turns out it's all kind of hot nonsense, but you really have to be careful about it because there's certain kinds of deeply held intuitions that people have about it. Like, really, this causal stuff is just kind of a stand-in, and like the real story is just like small particle things bumping into each other. And I had to like walk through no, really, even when you get to the small particle things bumping into each other, that's not it. Like that isn't sufficient to give you what you're doing up here. So a lot of my work has been on that. And actually the stuff I'm excited about in the next couple of years still is kind of coming full circle on some of those things. I think I'm in a better position to talk about it. Yeah, so that was really fun. The other thing that was really awesome is I got some very good advice that I should I should get a master's degree worth of courses in the philosophy department. So the philosophers of science, some of them were maybe more like skeptical of or condescending towards the like more proper philosophy.
Sure.
Whereas some other people pointed out, if you want to get a job, it's going to be in a philosophy department. You have to be able to talk to them and not sound condescending in your job interview. And that was probably the best advice I got in grad school. So that was Eric Ingner. Thank you, Eric. And then I took those classes and found there was just this great stuff. So I took this one class on action theory from John McDowell that was one of the hardest courses that I've ever taken.
Oh, McDowell, though. Very cool.
Wow. And it was amazing too, because it was not like any other courses. He doesn't really give you readings. There's like just things that you should have already read somehow. And then people will tell you, because there were people taking this course for like the third or fourth time, and they were very helpful and kind. So there's some more senior graduate students in the philosophy department who are great. And they're like, okay, so here's what you read, and you read some Sellers, and you read some Davidson, and you read some Hornsby. And then we spent like I'm not even exaggerating, 4 weeks on one footnote in Jennifer Hornsby.
Oh,
and
God.
By like week 3, I was so confused. I was like, I just don't know what we're doing here. And then we got to the 4th week, and then he was doing, it was like, when people play with those little wooden puzzles, and then somehow like now it pops open. That's what it felt like. He was like doing that, and we're like turning this little footnote over and over and over. And then suddenly you realize that like, no, this has been this massively important point that we just somehow got to by fiddling around.
Wow.
And like going through that experience, I was like, wow, I didn't understand how awesome and interesting this could be. So anyway, so the stuff about agency is, I think a lot of philosophers kind of wanted to sort of naturalize it away or say it's just causation or it's something else. But I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff in agency that we can be bringing in. So in that sense, I feel like my philosophy of science gets better when I bring in these other kinds of more straightforward philosophical topics.
Gotcha. Thank you for that story. That's absolutely fascinating about the
I
feel like if you could
recreate, I had to write a paper for that class before the end of the term. It was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do?
I just love there's no readings. It's just like things you should have read, and so you can figure it out.
And he was just such a kind, lovely person too. So he was actually a really wonderful, like, I don't know. It was hard to read. I tried reading some of his stuff before the class. And then I took the class and I really came to understand just how like soft-spoken and nice he is. And then I could go back and read his stuff, and it was like, now you hear it in his voice. And suddenly it was much clearer. So it was much easier to read his work after I took the course than before.
Makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So from your experience, I've noticed you had success. You've been teaching and researching at Simon Frasier now as a professional philosopher of science. Could you tell us a little bit about, some of your work that you feel like is, best representative of you as a philosopher of science, or some that you're the most proud of, or you feel the most recognized for?
So I take this. One of the things that I really enjoyed learning while I was in graduate school, was about the different ways in which you can be a philosopher. And so there were some people who, say, didn't have really lengthy publication records, but like they were some of the best philosophers, properly speaking, that I knew. Like the things that they could say insightfully about these readings to sort of help other people into it and to sort of do what I think of as live action philosophy was amazing. So for me, I think of, sometimes people are like, oh, here's a publication record. And I'm like, that's sort of like the congealed version of some of the stuff. So I think of what I do as much more live action. So in that regard, I'm slower at writing than I am at coming up with talks. So a lot of the systematicity to the stuff that I work on, you can see more from like the kinds of talks that I give. And that really is my favorite way of doing philosophy, is like giving a good talk to a good audience, and then you really get to hash it out in the Q&A. Like the places where they let the Q&A go on for an hour and a half because you're not done yet is like that's what I'm there for.
It's like your peer review right there. It's like, and little commentary, punch up of your work. Like it's amazing to me that people. Oh no, I was just saying, like, there's few people I think who can do philosophy by themselves, like in a room writing, and those people exist. But a lot of us, myself included, like it comes through talking things out. Generally, like it comes or you know, walking and talking. But like, anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So in that sense, giving talks is like my favorite venue for doing philosophy. And I think of it as a doing, like not here's a draft and the philosophy will be when it finally comes out. Like, no, what you're doing live action is the philosophy. And I also get to teach really awesome seminars here at Simon Frasier. So we have this great master's program, and it's like just a master's program. We don't have PhD students. So we focus on essentially people who are coming from different kinds of backgrounds, sometimes from different countries. Sometimes they took some years out. Sometimes they didn't major in philosophy. Sometimes they had a really rough couple of years, so their transcript looks very hot and cold. And then they come here and they get to sort of all get good with sort of solid foundation across different sub areas. So I get to have these really awesome seminars with these incredibly interesting people who are maybe encountering this for the first time, or they only know a little bit about it, but they're also just like really smart and on top of things. And we have really great discussions in classes. So I feel like my seminar teaching at the end of a good session with students who have been bringing in, for instance, discussion questions, and then I kind of moderate some of this, like you really come to understand something about the topic. And so that's also really fun. So in that regard, I feel like there's a bunch of stuff that is all at this nexus of how we should be thinking about what I call the foundations of causation. So I think we're at this really exciting point where, you know, sort of watching from 2000 when I got started here until now, like we're in one of those big branching outs from what I call natural philosophy to have causation become its own freestanding science. And it's really cool to be here for that. So I think physics did that back in the day, and then chemistry, and, you know, the psychology did this in like the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And I feel like causation is doing this now, but I feel like it's not quite done yet, because part of what it does require is a certain kind of like conceptual foundations of a certain sort to coordinate what's really going on. So it's the analogy that I'm using in something right now is that it's not like having money in the bank if you want to go cash your check, like, oh, what makes causation happen? Well, here's some stuff. It's more like, where is the gold reserve such that we have such a thing as a monetary system? And so you usually don't use your conceptual foundations in like doing day-to-day causal modeling, but in some real sense, they have to be there for that causal modeling to be coordinatable across all of these different areas of the other sciences that are now using it. So that's and I want us to sort of be less reductionistic about it, because I think the world is just like massively messy with causal structure. And I think that agency is like a really substantial causal structure that's even more complex than we've given it credit for. And we can like benefit from this. Like, we're not trying to like, if we try to simplify it, we're going to be sort of getting something wrong, or we're going to be, one of the big issues I think is people are like, oh, I never want to make a wrong causal claim. But what they end up doing is like refraining from making a whole bunch of causal claims that would be correct and well established. And so I feel like that's also an error that we need to correct. And so given how rampant causal structure is, we really need to sort of foreground, like, what is it that we're doing with this? Like, why are we looking for it? And what are the purposes to which we're putting it? And how is it sort of tied in these messy, even like social ways, so that we can actually more effectively use it? Yeah. So there's like the conceptual foundations all the way to the messy application in like real life stuff for causation.
Well, I appreciate you sharing. I'm trying to imagine a space. You said something really interesting about understanding causation as its almost own sort of like scientific discipline. And so I'm curious, like, what you have in mind, because obviously when I think about causation, and from what I've connected with in philosophy of science, or even just within a science, I think about causal principles or causal structure within a particular science. So what's the real? Obviously, it cuts through in a very distinct way. And so, what would that look like for you in terms of bringing causation to the fore? And I'm just curious. I think this is a really great, really interesting idea.
Okay. Well, thank you. One of the things that I've been struck by at SFU, and this has been really fun, there are people in a variety of other fields here that are already using essentially causal modeling and pattern recognition in different kinds of ways. So there's some people in like the computing science department who are doing it, and you have these really interesting ways in which, for instance, you have software that is taking the video feeds on a hockey game, and then there's this distinction between data and phenomena that you get from Jim Bogan and Jim Woodward. And Jim Bogan was one of my professors, and I've been very influenced by his thoughts on causation. He's very kind of more Anscomian than I think a lot of people realize. And so then you've got the stuff that counts as data. You've got these streams, but you want to reconstruct the phenomenon, which is like the game itself. But then you want to take this game, and now this game is kind of data that you want to treat as sort of exhibiting certain other kinds of phenomena. So you've got things like what kind of like, I don't know hockey very well. Don't tell Canada. No, I'm kidding.
What's that? That's fine. That's fine. It's okay.
But there's other sorts of like, what's your, shot on goal success ratio? And now that's a phenomenon for which the different things happening in the game are the data that you're using to sort of figure out what's going on there. And so there's all these really interesting layered, like there is no thing that's just intrinsically data or intrinsically phanomena. You're using them in these complex ways where they're trying, for instance, to figure out, okay, if somebody kicked this goal in like the Euro Cup, then who gets credit for it? Like, as it were, who caused that? It's a causal question. So they're reading, in order to solve these problems, because there's a lot of money in like the sports analysis, reading stuff on causation. I've also gotten to work with some people in the biomedical physiology department, and they're really interested in this sort of stuff too, because they have people working on different things in the body at all of these different size scales and levels of complexity. So if you're working on like the renal system of the kidneys, then you've got all kinds of things that you have to know. When can you put them together? When can you not? So in that regard, I feel like causation is kind of already out there.
Yeah.
And people are using it. But what I discovered in the biomedical physiology department is that a number of the people were not willing to start using the software to do causal modeling because they didn't, as they put it, they didn't understand what causation really is. They're like, I'm not entirely sure what I'm saying if I say there's a causal relationship between these variables. Like, what am I attributing? Like, what am I committing to? And they, in a way that I think philosophers of science don't always give the scientists credit for, what they were looking for was like the metaphysical foundations of causation. They're like, no, but really, what is causation? Nobody can just tell me what it is. They just tell me there's disagreements. So in that regard, they're waiting to sort of uptake this, because what is it that causation is such that they have anything in common with like, okay, what's causing this change in blood flow in the kidneys to who gets credit for scoring that goal in like the Spain versus Italy game or something like this. So I feel like the foundations are like, what is it such that causation is there?
Yep.
And here can I tell you about the work stuff too?
Yeah.
Am I rambling?
No. This is super. No. Keep going.
So I have one paper, Patterns, Information, and Causation. And that sort of lays out the groundwork in what I have come to realize is an overly dense way. So because I like giving talks and I don't like writing papers, I cram all the material into like one paper. And so it really should have been like 3 or 4 different papers. And so part of what I need to do in the next couple of years is like, I was going to do this and then COVID hit, but now I'll do it now, is sort of spin out like separately in a more easy for other people to understand way, how to think about that as a way of, causation is a thing that's in the world and really has to have some sort of close connection to like physical interactions. But that's not just, it's not a simple connection. And so that's where I borrowed from statistical mechanics and thermodynamics. Like they are already using the kinds of mathematical tools to represent this that we need over here for causation. So and looking at the way in which those two fields relate to each other is really helpful. So there's this idea of information theory that just kind of generalizes that. And then you can apply it if you're careful. It's not that anything you apply it to is thereby causal, but if you apply it in the correct way, you can use it for modeling causal foundations. The next thing I need to do for that, though, is also like really work people back from this idea that like really if I just squint, there is some like microphysical token that is the causal relatum at this moment. And that like somehow it's like well defined. Because I think when you really zoom in on the microphysical stuff, what ends up happening, and I call this counterfactual robustness, there's microphysical stuff happening, and then you try and draw a line, like, okay, does this particle count as in the microphysical base, or is it out? Like, does the line go over here, or does it go over there?
Right.
And the answer is there, because as long as this particle is within this range of velocity, then it's in there. But it could also have a different range, and then it would be out. And also, you could just not include it, and you would still, as it were, have the same macrophysical pattern. Like you would still have picked out the same relatum. There's all sorts of stuff you can change about the microphysics stuff, and you still have the same pattern. And so there isn't any determinate, like, little red line that you can draw and say determinately this and not that is the microphysical instantiation. So I think that's like a philosophical therapy thing. Like people are going to have to really envision their way through to see why this doesn't work. And then I got to give one talk, and then this is going to be a paper that sort of follows up on that. I think that, what is the analogy? So there's a relationship between energy and work in physics, where work isn't just energy, and you can end up doing a lot of work where you don't do a lot of, like, if you roll a ball to the top of a hill and then you like, you know, let it roll to the bottom again, like the total amount of, say, potential energy is zero, but you've done a lot of work. There was a lot of other stuff that happened, and you can measure it. Like there's equations for work, and work isn't like some fundamental quantity in the universe the way like lots of kinds of energy are conserved and are more fundamental. But I think that causation, so informational connections in the world are more like energy. But I think that causation is like work. So the relationship that it stands to information in is the way in which work stands to energy. And so I think that's how we should be thinking about what causation does.
Thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. It made me think, and perhaps this is I'm not sure if this isn't going to direct comparison, but I've been as someone who's come from a cognitive science and psychology. There's folks who do a lot of work in dynamical systems. And so the way you're talking about causation reminds me of the way that some of these folks talk about dynamics. And and in particular, just the way in which they don't just study psychology, they study dynamics. They often talk about having a dynamics toolkit to resolve or think about problems from a variety of disciplines. And so it made me think that, why couldn't there be something like causation, like a sort of a causation tool? I think it sounds like what you're approaching this less from an applied sense to some more fundamental questions regarding causation. But in some way, it's like I just see it's like this thing that cuts across these disciplines, but also is this thing that really excites in a way that it's just special and undeniably interesting and undeniably brings people together for both application and theory. And so, it was interesting hearing. I remember meeting Jim Woodward. I'm like, what do you work on? He's like, I work on causation. And I was like, what are you talking? Like what? Like what? But it's like, that makes sense now. Like, or like this, I mean,
but
I know
he doesn't work on the foundation stuff. He's been very clear. And it's been funny to watch over like the last 15, 20 years. Everyone wants him to work on the foundations and he doesn't. He's like, And they're like, but you're lacking this sort of stuff. And he's like, that's it. It's like, I don't have to do everything. Nobody has to do everything. So I think the dynamical system stuff is really interesting too. And I got into some of this from the cognitive neuroscience at the CNBC in Pittsburgh. And I think that in some sense, because I mean, you do a lot of dynamics in physics too. And what I want, so I think that that's sort of a slightly proper subset of essentially the foundations of causation.
That's fair.
Because I want to do something that's a little more like, even if you had different specific dynamical laws or different specific dynamics in the system, you would still know what to identify as the causal structure in it. And thus it has to be a little more like one layer more fundamental than the dynamical system stuff. So I think that's what they're doing. But the foundation still has to be something that, as it were, encompasses that, so that you can see why systems with different dynamics, or if we had different kinds of like dynamical equations governing the behavior of a system, like how can we say of all of these things, which parts are causal and which aren't? Well, because we have the sort of underlying theory about what it is about the dynamics that makes it that. So those fit really nicely in with the thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, because statistical mechanics is all about like, you've got these dynamical equations for the evolution of particles in, so, but the thermo comes in another layer, sort of on top of it.
Is there a current book like in the philosophy of science on causation, or more like a popular trade book that would get out
this is what I'm supposed to be writing, and I'm just
okay. I'm just saying,
so badly.
All the things that you just said, we would love to see. And you're right, like based on how you work, maybe a series of talks might be the thing too. But right, sometimes it's just a book is like right. I don't know, but I'm like, this is.
We need so here I'll announce it on the podcast first. This is the project for like the next 2 years, and I'll just it's called Foundations of Causation.
Great,
and it's supposed to be something that doesn't presuppose that any, like, there's a lot of background discussion on causation that I think is anti-helpful. It's not just neutral, but it like obscures rather than illuminates. And I think we're now to a position where you can sometimes just say stuff. And I've noticed for graduate students who want to get into it, for colleagues in other departments, when they ask me for this very thing, I have nothing to give them. And I finally decided, like, okay, this is, there's enough people who could do better causal reasoning if you had something like this. And here I got to teach a couple times this causal reasoning course. And I just saw, because of, Joel Smith had a really great approach to this, how much more effective it made these students when they went out into the world. So anyways, it's on the long list of things to do, but I procrastinate my writing so badly.
Sure. So. I get you. I get it. I understand. And so that's why, talks are nice because they're deadline driven. So it's often, it's like, this has got to be done in a certain time. Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you so much. So we've covered a lot of your sort of major works, major thinking, as well as leading into already sort of things you're most excited about. Are there any things you wanted to mention in terms of like side interest or things that you do? Like a lot of philosophers of science, they have their core program, but then they do just other things that are maybe related or maybe even not so much. So I was curious, you seem like a big thinker, having a lot, you have lots of ideas. So I was curious about other stuff that you get into. Yeah.
Well, so I have a big problem with this because I'm very easily distractible by shiny projects. Like, and that's why I haven't done other things, is I'm like, yeah. So no, like I had this opportunity to write something on Emily de Châtelet, sort of reevaluating her supposed textbook. Was it really a textbook? And does she really count as just giving commentary? I think no, actually, this is when, at least according to all of the criteria that Kuhn gives, Kuhn should have identified really her, and maybe Euler as like the two people where physics as a science, separate from natural philosophy, got started. So I'm writing on that instead of, other sorts of things. I've been doing some stuff on science fiction, and I think that that's really interesting because there's a lot of really great new, like long science fiction. So like novels, essentially. So I think a lot of philosophers are familiar, like with people like Ted Chiang and others, you can get really effective, like short stories that illustrate a philosophical point. And I think for a second book, Ted Chiang was just like reading, I really think he was just reading philosophy and taking it and writing short stories. But I think in the long versions, you have to make a kind of coherent world and then run something in there that's essentially an argument for something. Like they're essentially making the case. And they're doing it in a different venue than you ordinarily do for philosophy. But there's a way in which what they're doing is an extremely well-executed thought experiment to illustrate why we should hold a particular view, for instance, about like memory or self-identity. So we just read, like, for this class that I was teaching, the Arkady Martine books. What is it? A Memory Called Empire and A Desolation Called Peace. And they were fantastic for memory devices and how those would be embodied and involved with your personal identity. And you can't, like, half-ass it in a too novel thing. Does that make sense? Like, you have to have worked it all out carefully. So I feel like long-form science fiction has this amazing capacity for us to work out thought experiments in a much more detailed way. Yeah.
But the world has to be there for us to fully explore the question or fully explore what we're doing. It has to be internally coherent in a way that really makes it make sense in a certain kind of way. So I feel like these are real. I'm looking at my shelf over here because I've got a whole bunch of philosophical science fiction there. So I feel like that part's really fun. The other thing is that I always have enjoyed doing a lot of like historical stuff too. So one of the things that I tell my students is that, whatever kind of debate we're having now that's been playing out over, say, like the last 5 to 8 years, chances are really, really small that we're the first people to be having this. And probably we're having a less awesome version of it than they had like 50 years ago or 150 years ago or 300 years ago. And so there's this way in which you can read these things and you're like, suddenly I realized that the solution is just sitting here really well worked out in this person that we've all sort of forgotten had written about this. And so then it's kind of like, you go digging in a big potato field and there's just like gold coins everywhere. And there's just like really great ideas that are sort of sitting there waiting for us to sort of like incorporate them or respond to them. Like it's instead of sort of reinventing the wheel, but doing it sort of awkwardly and okay. There's somebody who like invented it and then it went through 150 years worth of refinement and they have a much better wheel. And we should just shortcut to that version of it. Sure.
Yeah. So in that sense, I'm doing this stuff where I'm sort of taking these longer historical lead-ins to how we got to, this is the thing that we're currently disagreeing about. Because often when you back it up, so the stuff about causation and the microphysical, really, if you back it up, it comes back to this sort of debate between Anscombe and Davidson about explanation of action. And so that's where we got like the causal exclusion problem was from Kim sort of slightly misunderstanding, I think, Davidson's anomalous monism. And if you sort of back it up a step before that, what you get is Davidson and Anscombe disagreeing about action explanation. And whether or not it's like these other forms of causal explanation. And you're like, and then you can sort of see this other path forward that just bypasses the sort of, entrenchment that you can get in some of these debates. Gotcha. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yep. I appreciate that, Holly. All right. Well, we've talked about a number of your projects. You've given some excellent insight into some of your thoughts, your future plans. Let's finish with our last question. What do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
It's a good one. So one of the things that's been really fun about being at the University of Pittsburgh was really seeing what it took to, because it was sort of crucially involved in establishing philosophy of science as its own field. And part of that was establishing the Philosophy of Science Association as its own organization. And then a lot of really awesome people sort of like chipping in their time to keep the PSA going, because really it's just run on a shoestring and everybody's best efforts. So watching how much you can have a certain kind of discussion when there is an organizational format for it has been really interesting. And I feel like philosophy of science always has a certain kind of danger where sort of synchronically, if you want, like you don't want to just be doing sort of pop science. Like you want there to be real philosophical content. But so sometimes you sort of don't do justice to the science. On the other side, sometimes we have this tendency within philosophy of science to be like a little, to sort of denigrate philosophy more than we should. And I feel like they have some really good stuff and they use different vocabulary, but sometimes there's like really interesting stuff going on in social epistemology right now where they're sort of reinventing things we did over here and we're reinventing things they're doing. And it would be a much more fruitful discussion to sort of interact more. At the same time, it's hard. I've talked to people doing like metaphysics and wanting to do philosophy of science, and they keep getting frustrated because people are like, well, but I haven't read Kuhn and I haven't read this and I haven't read that. And it's like, there's a way in which the ongoing literature to which you're responding, like this big stream of stuff. You're not literally responding to Kuhn, but you're responding to like the fifth iteration of people responding to Kuhn or these other people. And so when you sort of pop over here and you're like, oh, wait, but I have this theory. And you're like, yeah, but we saw that in the 70s and we know how it dies in the late 80s. So there's a way in which people sometimes try and come into philosophy of science and they're like, oh, but it's too inconvenient to try and like read all of the stuff to get up to speed. And I think philosophers of science need to remember that like there's a reason that we've been reading and responding to these things. Like there's a real kind of awesome coherence to this discussion and how it unfolds. And you want to sort of balance, drawing on other fields with maintaining this kind of consistency of discussion so that we really don't end up just reinventing the same thing and having the same discussions every 15 years. And that ties into I think it's better to take the longer run in. So sometimes people are like, here's this important discussion. And then like the earliest paper they cite is maybe 5 years ago. You're like, well, I guarantee there were other people who have said this more than 5 years ago. And you also have to look for that because that also will make your work better. So I feel like in that sense, taking a longer historical run-in, even if you go back 30 years instead of 5, you will often find there's a few things that you can sort of pick out that really are like these turning points that led to whatever discussion you're currently having. And so in that sense, it's hard because that's just a lot of stuff to keep track of. You have to know your science and you have to sort of read the background literature and you have to stay aware of what's going on in the other fields. But I think that's what makes philosophy of science like this really unique subfield. So I feel like we are a subfield that's different than other subfields in philosophy. And I think that's part of it, is that it has this real internal coherence to the discussion.
Well, see, I appreciate that, your thoughts on this. And I think you mentioned something interesting, especially relation between more traditional analytic philosophy and philosophy of science. And that is a question of to what degree there is some hope. And I like what you're saying, that like we're kind of maybe working on these problems that they've, reinventing the problems that they've kind of resolved, they're sort of doing, and vice versa. Is there something like do you have any thoughts on like what could bring, foster some kind of additional sort of, you mentioned things like history. Are there other things that we could do where to take this more seriously? Because even from coming, 5 or so years ago in graduate school, there was that sort of unfortunate sort of divide at times between the two, and there was definitely some overlap and friendliness, but it was like, there was like, you do this, I do that, or you don't, it was dismissive at times. And so I appreciate hearing this sort of positive, more like this isn't, I just feel like that dismissiveness isn't very helpful.
I feel like it isn't very helpful. So I feel like some of it's kind of sociological.
Sure.
I feel like you just have to, there's a weird anti-intellectualism to dismissing philosophy from the position of philosophy of science. And I think we just shouldn't do that. Like sometimes I've heard people say very dismissive things about action theory, for example. And I'm like, you literally know nothing about it. That's just a kind of, epistemic arrogance to say of something that you don't know anything about that is not worth doing or that it has no good ideas. And so I think in that sense, you just have to sort of like resist that temptation to be condescending on both sides. I've been dismayed by some of the people who are like, oh, philosophy of science, I can just pop in and talk about this topic. And they feel like even though there's other people over here already talking about it, it's too inconvenient for them to have to keep up with this literature. And so other fields can sometimes get really, really insular. And then it's hard because then they're really not talking to you. And if you try and talk to them, they're like, la, 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 I don't hear you. And so but I feel like that's also kind of partly sociological.
Yeah.
But I feel like the things that help are when you actually end up sharing some of the same space. So I'm not a big fan of like bringing in lots of outside stuff to the PSA because the PSA already has a really tightly scheduled, there's already more really great philosophy of science that you can't do anywhere else. So I think the PSA has this kind of opportunity for people doing really scientifically rich stuff, including with scientists, to present their work that wouldn't work, for example, at the APA meetings. At the same time, there's different kinds of philosophy of science that you can have more of at the APAs. So I've found that in the the recent couple of like Pacific APAs, there's been more philosophy of science in a more substantive, right? And more philosophers of science in the room for other stuff. And then you learn about other things, but also they learn from you when you ask certain kinds of questions. And I feel like those have been sort of fruitful for kind of like bringing more of these areas together. So I feel like philosophers of science sort of tend to pick their favorite conferences. So it might be like Ishkabibble or it might be PSA.
Right.
But also, like, if we want those other kinds of discussions, like if you want the accidental, wow, I didn't know you were thinking about that, that's surprisingly related to what I do, you got to show up to a bunch of stuff that doesn't look related to what you do. So there has to be this kind of like openness to the fortuity that can happen when you show up to something that looks not like your area.
Great.
Yes.
Well, Holly, thank you. Thank you so much. I love those suggestions. And hopefully those are things we can, promote to the future scholars. Perhaps those are some themes that you could bring to that the conference in October as well, the philosophy of science, past, present, and future in University of Minnesota. I guess that's for the future scholars as well, but just,
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate getting to meet you and just getting to chat. And hope to see you. Maybe come say hello at the PSA. I think I should be attendance.
When I'm more relaxed, that would be very fun to catch up.
Yeah. Don't worry about. Yeah. Of course. But all right, we'll have a wonderful time in Vancouver, and I'll talk to you soon.